Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Immaculata DeVivo, and I am professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School, professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and the Melanie Mason Nemec 71 co-director of the sciences at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. It's a real pleasure to welcome you today to our book talk program. I am especially delighted to be introducing our featured author, my good friend and colleague, Janet Rich Edwards. This event is part of Harvard Radcliffe Institute's Summer 2026 series of Virtual Radcliffe Book Talks, which highlights recent publications by authors and subjects connected to Radcliffe. Today, we will be focusing on Janet's debut novel, Canticle. Some of you know Janet, primarily through her path-breaking work in women's health and epidemiology. She is an associate professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and an associate professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, where she serves as director of life course epidemiology at the Mary Horrigan Connors Center for Women's Health Research at the Brigham and Women's Health Hospital. Janet's research and teaching focus on determinants of women's reproductive health across the life course, as well as prenatal and childhood factors that affect the risk of developing chronic disease in adulthood. As if that weren't enough, she was also a Radcliffe Fellow in 2019. Janet has now added author to her many credentials with Canticle. She brings her remarkable curiosity about women's lives across time into the realm of historical fiction. Set in 13th century Bruges, the novel follows a young woman whose spiritual devotion and search for independence draws her into a community of women living at the edge of medieval church's authority. As she navigates questions of faith, power, and belonging, we see a world in which women are testing the limits of what is possible within and against the structures that constrain them. The book has already received extraordinary attention. Canticle has been longlisted for the Carol Shields Prize and named an editor's pick and best of selection by a range of outlets. Reviewers have praised its vivid evocation of the medieval city and its nuanced portrayal of a heroine whose questions feel strikingly contemporary. It is a wonderful example of how fiction can illuminate the past while speaking directly to the present. We are so pleased that Janet will be in conversation today with Rachel Barenbaum. Rachel is the author of Atomic Anna and A Bend in the Stars, both celebrated works of historical fiction that weave together science, history, and deeply imagined characters. She is also the host of Check This Out, a literary radio show on New Hampshire Public Radio that highlights emerging and diverse authors. We're fortunate to have both Rachel with us to help guide and deepen today's discussion. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute's Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we are truly grateful. We also want to gratefully acknowledge the Steiner's Dean's Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting this event. We encourage those watching on Zoom to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program. Since we anticipate a lot of interest, we ask that you keep your questions brief. This will help Janet and Rachel respond to as many as possible in the time we have together. Please also keep an eye on the chat, where we will post links to upcoming Radcliffe Summer Book Talks and information about registration for future events. It is now my great pleasure to give the virtual floor to Janet Rich Edwards, who will offer a brief reading before engaging in conversation with Rachel Barenbaum. Janet, the floor is yours. Thank
Thank you, Immaculata. That's really a nice introduction by, as you say, a good friend. In fact, this whole thing feels like a homecoming. Thank you to everyone at Radcliffe for making this happen. As I know, it must feel a homecoming to Rachel as well, who's also a double degree Harvard alum. So I am so happy to talk about Canticle and read to you from it. I'm going to read you the prologue. So if anybody has a book, that's just right at the beginning. And it's pretty short. So, Bruges, County of Flanders, 1299. The young woman appears in the square, wearing neither veil nor wimple, her short brown hair plaited behind her neck. She's covered by a cloak of fine maroon wool. Specks of white ash have drifted to land on her shoulders like snowflakes. The acrid smell of bonfire is already in the air. Witnesses will later swear the girl was lit like a taper, and some will claim she had a halo. They'll say the brass steeplecock spun as she entered the square, and the clouds broke apart, fleeing south, fleeing north, at once, all directions. Impossible. Church bells snapped their stays, and a wild clanging rose from every corner of the great city. No one is quite sure what happened. As the crowd parts before her, a lace seats the path of gray cobblestones receding to the stake. Parchment is piled high at its base. Smaller fires have already been lit, dotting the plaza. They're burning her words, too. A chant of Sint! Sint! Rises from the crowd. Even now, even though the church has named her heretic, the people still call her saint. It's true and not true. They're all saints. They are none of them saints. They think her a miracle worker. They think she speaks with God. But really, everyone does. It's just so hard to hear. She takes a step, another step, her heart hammering. Adieu, she thinks. I go to God. This time, truly, I go to God. So that's the prologue. I'd love to invite Rachel in to join me.
Jenna, thanks. Thanks so much for having me here and to Radcliffe and to everyone who's joining us today. I'm super excited to talk about this beautiful, incredible book, Canticle. If you haven't bought your copy, go out and get it. I've seen this book, been reading versions of it for a few years now, and it just kept getting better. So I'm very excited. For me, and I think for most people, this is really a book that's about faith and mysticism, mysticism as feminism. And so there is religion in it, but it's not a religious book. And it is set in 13th century Bruges, which may also sound a little bit obscure, but truly, Janet, it is not. You make it not obscure. Can you help us think about how we approach a book, your book, Canticle, from the 13th century, from us sitting here in 2026?
Yeah, so I've always loved historical fiction for its ability to, transport us someplace else. And so it is such a pleasure to bring readers to this moment in European history. 1300 is this time when there was this increased sort of religious fervor, coming up from the grassroots. The church was all powerful and frankly, at that moment in history, pretty corrupt. And people were resisting. And you get all these forms of resistance coming out right in this moment in this most beautiful of cities. I don't know if, for those of you who've been to Bruges, it's spectacular. It's still spectacular. It's got an intact, interior sort of medieval city. And it it was really fun to be able to bring that to life.
And what you do is you bring this mysticism as feminism, that energy of possibility is something that we feel now. It feels very modern. And so you bring that forward. And we're in the moment in history of like Genghis Khan, right? Magna Carta, Notre Dame is just being built, like sort of to put us in the moment, right? That's where we are. Give us the plot. So, what is Canticle about plot wise? Like, what are we doing in the 13th century?
Yeah, so Canticle follows the life of a young woman, Elise, who is something of a mystic. She's had sort of grown up with occasional sort of great mystical visions. And she's running from home on the eve of a marriage she doesn't want to a wool merchant. Um, she flees and thinks she's going to join the rather radical Franciscan friars. Friars are one of the movements that had sprung up at this time. And they're think of the brown robed and hooded guys with who own nothing but those robes and the begging bowls in their hands. And she thinks she's going to join them as the first female Franciscan friar in Flanders. The good friars, of course, have no idea what to do with her. So they end up housing her with the Beguines. Now I'm going to pause and I'm going to spell that because it's incredible. Nobody has heard of the Beguines. It's Beguines. And it is this grassroots movement of women who bonded together in their own independent communities that were economically self-sufficient and refused the rule of the church. So Alais joins the Béguinage and begins to work what might be miracles. And so the town goes wild with this. And the local bishop, a very ambitious man, begins to see how he could use her to his advantage. And so, of course, all hell breaks loose. That's the framework of the story.
So it is very much it's a feminist novel, and it is very much about a very early moment in feminism, right? That I wasn't aware of when options for women were so limited. So I love that we're doing this here at Radcliffe. And before we go any further, I feel like we just have to talk for a minute about where this idea came from, because of course this very Radcliffe-like idea and group of women, right, that is in your book started with Radcliffe. So where did this come from? Tell us about it.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a total Radcliffe story. So I was lucky enough to be a fellow in 2019, and I was there for my science. That's how I'd sort of gotten the position, and I had been kind of a closet fiction writer for a little bit of time. I didn't tell that many people, and at that moment, I had a book in the drawer, as one does, one that I'd written, my first sort of a novel for adults. That had gotten me an agent, but not a publisher. And I was looking around for something new to write. And I attended the lecture by a fellow, Katie Bruges, who was a historian, who was talking about medieval women's literary habits, sort of, were they illustrating, psalters and the like, or were they not? It was a fascinating talk, and it revived in me. I had, as a young woman in my 20s, I had sort of fallen in love with the mystics and read pretty much everything a mystic ever wrote from the Middle Ages, and then sort of put it away when I got busy with work and, raising a family and all that. And when Katie spoke, it all came flooding back to me. And as an older woman at that point, I thought, well, what about their lives? These mystics were saying things that were quite incredible. And it was dangerous quite a bit at the time to talk about the visions they were getting. And so I thought, oh, what if I wrote a story about a mystic and about her life and tried to get inside that skin a little bit? Yeah.
I love that. It's like the Radcliffe magic. And also, there was another book that came out of that exact same lecture.
Yeah, Lauren Groff was also a fellow there, obviously for writing, and she wrote Matrix based on that. I think she pretty much, if you saw her last week, I think she pretty much went from that lecture and started Matrix right then and there, which is
I love it. Maybe
yeah.
more books are coming. You never know.
No, exactly. Maybe the physicist is gonna do one.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so we are in 13th century Bruges, and we are in this feminist movement, and at the heart of your novel is the character Alais. Tell us about Alais.
So Alais is what I think of as a young philosopher, really. So when you think of what philosophy was, what sort of intellectual questions were about at that moment, they were really about religion. They were sort of what we think of now as theologic questions. And Alais has a strong sense that there is something else beyond the world we see. And she wants to interrogate that. And her way to do that is to try to get close to God. So she has this passion to find out more. So it's almost an intellectual drive in a way towards these questions. But she's young, she's pretty much 17 years old for most of the novel. And so she's also a young woman figuring out all the things that young women need to figure out, through the ages.
Right. And so she doesn't have options the way we think of options today, right? I mean, what were her choices? What could she have done?
Right. So as a woman in 1300, you basically had two choices, if you had choices at all. You either married, or if you had the money, you needed a pretty big dowry, you could join a convent if there were spaces. And that particular moment in history, there were very few spaces. And that is really why the Beguine movement grew up. Women were frustrated with those two choices, and so they began to band together, first in these, small households of women who would take in mending, and then these communities grew and grew and gained some patrons, often wealthy women, and eventually you have these court beguinages, they're called, where women would sort of run businesses from them. So
Yeah.
Elise really has sort of the choice of marriage, or she's trying to find this alternative by joining the friars, which is a really unusual and frankly unrealistic choice. But she's 17. What does she know?
Right, right. Well, I mean, this is so we're talking again about 13th century Bruges, but she's so modern. I mean, she's a woman because when we first meet her, she's falling in love with a boy named Finn, right? And she has this, open heart and she's thinking, I could marry for love and I have this whole future coming. And then her heart is crushed. And right, and then we think, what is she going to do? Let's talk about that moment because that's where she's really real. She comes alive, and that's pretty early on in the novel.
Yeah. So yes. So she needs to be a real person, right? So the thing about mystics, right, as we have received them, and saints, is that we get their sort of heavily curated lives, but you don't get much about the real people behind them. And so Elise needs to be, a young woman who's got a crush on this boy who's gonna, spoiler, happens pretty soon in the book, who's gonna, as you say, crush her heart. Um, and she's got to some extent, she sublimates that energy, that passion into her quest for God. God becomes her beloved at that point in the book. So it's an important turning point for her. It's also useful as a foil. Finn comes back later, and we get to sort of contrast his choices versus hers a little bit. So he serves a couple purposes in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, but also she's faced with after things don't work out with Finn, and her family tries to arrange a marriage for her to a much older man, right? And so she's looking at her prospects, and here she is, the 17-year-old, smart, full of energy, right? Ready for the world woman, and she's like, I'm not marrying an old man. And right, so what am I going to possibly do? And that's when the church comes in, right? I mean, those are sort of her options. It's not like for me, it didn't seem like from the beginning that she had, had this call to God from the very first moment of her life, right? It was that she didn't really have options. And here you bring us to the Beguines and women who are actually running businesses. So
Mm-hmm.
she has, right? It's an option, right? She could actually do something, which is so inspiring. So let's talk about that moment where she's realizing these women are running businesses. Like, let's go back to that because that's interesting.
Yeah, so one of the fascinating things about the Beguines, so they're running businesses, they're also running hospitals and schools, and the thing they're most particularly known for is visiting people at their deathbeds. And they're known to have particular skill in ushering people from this life to the next life. And they wear gray. And people consider them kind of spooky, and they're a little freaked out that all these women are living together without any men. And so people would really malign the Beguines. So the only thing that Elise has heard about Beguines is that basically that they're lewd, and that they are wild women. And so when she meets up with Friar Lucas, the head of the Franciscans, and they don't know what to do with her, and they're like, we're going to put her with the Beguines. She's like, you've got to be kidding me. It's like the last place you can put me. I'm destined for a religious life. I can't go live with the Beguines. And then, of course, you go visit. He drops her off in the Beguinage, or Beguinhof, as it is in the book, for those who've read it, because I go back and forth a little bit with the Dutch and the French. And she walks in, and the city, the loud mercantile city, which is what Bruges is, just falls away. And it's this quiet oasis of this ring of homes around a green. And it is run by women and it has an entirely different feel. They are, in fact, quite pious. These are women who want to bang together and lead pious lives, but they don't want to be nuns and they want their independence. So they're a really interesting uh, group and community, and there are so many different lenses looking at them from different parts of society. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're sort of outsiders in every sense, right? They don't want to marry. They don't want the traditional life that, was out prescribed for women. And they're going to the deathbed. Like they're strange in every single way. And yet Elise fits in with them.
She does. At first, she thinks she's better than they are. This is, a big arc in her learning. She's pretty snobby about her sort of religious path, that she's going to be on like the fast path to God. And here are these women sort of involved in sort of charity, and they sort of read what bits of the Bible they can get to each other, and she's like, this isn't me. But of course, she learns that's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. All right. So you're bringing up one of my favorite things to talk about in this novel, reading. She sits down and reads. So reading is a form of resistance and rebellion. Let's talk about reading and the role that that plays in your debut, Canticle.
Yeah. This fascinated me when I was doing the research about it. So let me set the context, set the table for this. So um, we're at the end of the Crusades, and the Crusades have opened up these cities with all these new markets, and merchants need to be able to read and write to conduct business. And so there was a growing literacy, particularly among men, but also among some women. And the more people read, the more they begin to question. And so this is a piece of the foment that's going on. But there's not that much to read at this point. We're still 150 years away from the printing press. We're 300 years away from the first novel. So the only thing that, out there to read, even if you can read, if you're reading in Dutch, or, French, a handful of courtly love poems. But aside from that, you're stuck with like ledgers. And so in that context, the best stories around are the Bible stories. But people can't read them because they're in Latin. And the Pope is tightly controlling translations. And there are no translations of the Bible into Dutch or Flemish at this point. So that sort of sets the stage for this group of women who are very, very curious and want to know more.
Right. Of course they do. And so, first of all, they want to rebel by learning to read
Mm-hmm.
because that is not something women are doing. And second of all, they want to translate.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole idea that the Pope is controlling information, right? Censorship by not allowing translation is just crazy and yet so modern at the same time,
Right.
right? We
Yes,
talk about
exactly.
how does this book set in 1290s Bruges so important for today's reader and person. We talk about, right, it is this control of information. It has been happening ever since. Let's talk about that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So, you know, the argument from the church at the time was that you needed a lifetime of study. You basically needed to be a monk or sort of highly educated clergyman to understand the Bible. And so that was sort of their excuse. You can look at it entirely differently and say, well, this was about well power. The Waldensians, for example, were famous for having translated the Bible into German and ended up being burned at the stake for it, and for noticing that, oh, the word Pope actually doesn't occur in the Bible. And so there were a lot of politics. And while it wasn't strictly illegal to translate, it was pretty illegal to make it inaccurate translation. And, the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So it was a very, very risky thing to do.
Yeah, and yet she's trying to do it. I mean, she wants to read, she wants to bring these texts, these stories, these ideas out to the world. And all like meanwhile, as all this is happening, Elise also becomes known as a miracle worker.
Yeah.
right? Or like she has miracles. So there's a lot to talk about here. Tell us about her as miracle worker. Like, how does she get that reputation?
Yeah, so she is working in the hospital that's run by the Beguines, and uh, suddenly she feels particularly useless in the hospital. She has no training in it. Basically, they're telling her is, well, just pray over him. And so she sits down to do that with a young man who's clearly, on his way out. And she starts the prayer. She starts the Ave Maria, and it becomes poetic. It circles around and around and around. She's sort of surrounded by the words, and suddenly she notices that he's responding, and suddenly it all opens up, and she sees, she sort of it's this sort of miraculous vision, and she sees him healed. And in fact, he does rise from the deathbed, um, cured. And then the vision, of course, disappears. She doesn't know what's happened. She has no idea what just happened. But of course, everybody around her are like, heal me, sister, come to me. And the word gets out, and the town gets so excited, and they're dropping off, offerings at the Begenhof door. And, they are, somebody's taking the water from her basin, when she washes her face, and selling it on the streets, in little vials with red thread. And everybody wants a piece of her at that point, but she doesn't even know if it's real, right? So
Right.
sometimes she feels the thing in her fingers, sometimes she doesn't. And people have such strong motives for wanting the miracles to be real.
Yeah. So you, of course, are trained as a scientist,
Yeah.
as a researcher, right? Rigorous research science. That is your life, your career. And here you are writing about someone who may or may not be a miracle worker, right? A mystic. And this was a thing then. People would write about it, right? Look for miracle workers. How did you think about that as you were writing Canticle?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. It's sort of a deep one. As a scientist, I I feel like I feel like you have to recognize the limits of science, right? We can examine what we can measure, but we can't claim to know anything about what we don't measure, what we can't measure. And I think a lot of the ineffable, a lot of the sacred is no less real for the inability of science to try to capture it and reduce it, to an experiment. So to me, it's not at all incompatible to hold strong belief in the scientific method, but also um, a strong sense that there's more than that, and that there's mystery. And, I sometimes think like, what if you could have the answers? What if you really could know everything that God knows, or if Elise could have known everything? And there's a part of me that thinks I'd be disappointed, if there were no more mystery left in the world. I don't want ChatGPT to tell me whether miracles are real or not. I want to explore it.
Right. Right. And also there's a sense of like you're saying, I think Elisa, there's not always an answer, like you're saying, for everything.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's in your heart, your way forward. And in that sense, it's very human. It's a very
Yeah.
human side.
Yeah. And also, as a writer, and Rachel, you remember this, because we were in the same courses, you want to leave room for your reader, right? You want to leave space for the reader to have their own opinions and their own views, inject their own understanding. And so it was really important to me in this story not to be too deterministic about it,
Yeah.
and to some extent I try to actually sort of hide a little bit where I might be as the author, just to make room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also that, again, this goes back to the humanity because even you, a premier researcher, scientist, right, will sit there sometimes and say, we don't always know the
Yeah.
answer. This is
Yeah.
life. And that's your character, Elise. And this is reminding me of when we had first talked about this book a while back. You were talking about, your time in the Peace Corps
Mm.
and ways back and what you were reading back then and how you were thinking about life and the world then and you were inspired by books then. Can you share that and sort of how that is in this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had been in the Peace Corps right after college. I think 6 days after graduation, I was in Niger, which is in West Africa, and I was working in a maternal and infant clinic. Um, which I loved. About a year into it, you probably remember the Ethiopian famine, 1985. It actually stretched across the whole Sahel, the whole desert belt of Africa. And it was really tough. There wasn't enough to eat. Kids were really getting sick, and we were losing kids in the clinic. And I had been raised, vaguely Unitarian, not with a strong faith of any kind. And the only people I'd known who died at that point have been my grandparents. And so I was thrown for a loop. I didn't know what to make of this. And my mom, who knew how much I relied on reading during those years, into the night with the lantern, had sent me this army duffel bag full of books. Like, imagine a whole army duffel bag. It was like such wealth to get that bag of books. And in there, she had put in Houston Smith's sort of surveyed religions then called The Religions of Man. And I remember going through and reading about all the great traditions and thinking, oh my goodness, to me, they seemed like they were all saying the same thing, trying to get at the same ineffable, sacred thing. One of them is like that parable of the blind men with the elephant. One of them gets the trunk, one of them gets the head, but everybody's trying to describe this same thing. But I was also deeply suspicious of religious institutions. I got a message, my internet's unstable. Did I just go out for a bit?
You did for me. I'm not sure for everyone else, but
Oh dear.
we'll
Okay.
keep going. We're
Okay,
good.
let's
You're
keep going.
back.
So anyway,
You're
so
back.
I discovered these mystics out of, a bit of a desperation to figure out how to think about the death that we were coming across in Niger. And yeah, read them widely and just was so struck by how beautiful and often how loving the visions are and how they're at odds with what I had thought of as messages from the church.
Yeah. So this is amazing because you see that, the deep thought, the true, right, struggle, I think that you have had with this idea of science versus mysticism versus, right? I mean, there's not always an answer, which is a hard thing to deal with, especially when you're 17-year-old in 13th century Bruges here, your main character, Elise. And then she is declared, let's go back to her now.
Yeah.
And so she's declared a miracle worker and she becomes a celebrity. And you had touched on that. And so many parts of her celebrity, and we're back in like 1290s, are so similar to today's celebrity culture. It's eerie. People want, they're following her everywhere. Now they don't have phones to like take pictures, right? But she can't go out into a crowd. People are trying to pull off her clothing. Like it's violent. They're violating her. It's horrible. And she feels attacked. Let's talk about that, her as celebrity and that parallel to modern celebrities.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I did some sort of like looking at paparazzi scenes to sort of get a sense of what that would feel like and look like. And yeah, I mean, once people thought they had a saint in their midst, they literally wanted a piece of her because, relics, perhaps pieces of her clothing, could, in theory be used to work miracles. And so people wanted to get close. They wanted favors. Um, her her main spiritual advisor, Friar Lucas, who's a main character in the book, um, doesn't understand why she's getting these sort of favors from God and he's not. And that becomes a major plot line as he becomes increasingly jealous. And his brother, the bishop, sees this as a way to get the attention of Rome, for his own promotion. And so, yeah, everybody wants a piece of her, and she's really herself unsure about the miracles, and she gets sort of stuck between, wanting to be grateful for this gift that she may have received from God and feeling the duty to use it, but it's wrecking her. It's
Yeah.
really, yeah,
As it does today too. I mean, this was
yeah,
so prescient, so modern. This, if you can't walk outside without a crowd and without being watched, what kind of life do you have? And she's totally unequipped to answer that and to find a way through. She's basically by herself. She's a teenager. And so her answer is to become an anchoress. And we see, right, she goes into this sealed room. Tell us, what is an anchoress? How does she deal with it? And what is her next stage in life?
Yeah, this is another totally fascinating thing about the late Middle Ages. So,
I just want to say this is real. Like Janet did not make this up, what she's about to tell us about. All
yeah,
right, so go
yeah,
for it, Janet.
yeah.
What is
So
it?
there was this desire, again, as part of this upwelling religious fervor, people wanted to be sort of devote themselves to lives of prayer. And for some people, that went so far as to wanting to become a hermit, kind of like the old desert fathers, that model. But if you were a woman, you can't like wander out into the woods and become a hermit, in 1300. So the solution was to create these anchor holds, they're called. And they were typically uh, cells built on the side of churches, like a barnacle on the side of a church. And there was one room, the hold, for the anchoress or anchorite, if you were a man, and an adjoining room for the maid who would come and pass through the little window your meals and take away waste. And people committed themselves to the anchor hold for life. They didn't come out. They were committed there, and they had there was a window between the anchor hold and the church, typically called the squint, often shaped like a cross and cut at an angle so nobody could see in, so that you could actually see services and participate in communion. And you had, this one window covered by a black cloth or a shutter where you could give advice to people from the town, and they would come and they would ask you practical questions and spiritual questions. And do I want to join this convent, or do I, will you pray for my wife who's, in childbed? And so it wasn't completely alone, but you were physically alone for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine how terrified she must have felt to choose this and the other women, right? Because they just feel so violated by everyone trying to touch her and pull her clothes off and strip her, right? So she's not actually raped in the book, but it feels like she's violated in so many ways that her only safety is to choose being sealed off in a room in the church. It's like insane. And yet, when I'm reading this, I'm like, I get it. I know why Elise wants this.
Yeah, and she also sort of has positive reasons. Her raison d'etre, she wants union with God. She's a little puzzled by God, like why is God like sort of almost plagued her with this gift? But she wants to be able to have a quieter life so she can pray, essentially. And so for her, it's a freedom. And I think for a
Yeah.
lot of the anchoresses, and when you consider what women's lives were, you didn't have time alone, um, you know, particularly if you weren't in a convent, and so it was actually kind of a privileged position to be an anchoress at that time. And there were hundreds in England in particular, but also in Northern Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems
Wow. I mean,
crazy.
that's just
Yeah, I know.
it blows my mind. And of course, on the juxtaposed to that are the men in the church, and you touch on the corruption and the
Mhm.
men who are doing everything they can to maintain control and order, right? Banning translations, not letting people learn how to read. Let's talk about the corruption in the church because it's in the background of almost every scene here and how that's affecting your characters' lives.
Yeah, so the church at this point is a very political institution, right? It controls everything from, who's named emperor to what you're allowed to call your children. And it's a moment when money is really important in the church. And you have both simony, the selling of offices, and you have the selling of pardons for people. You can even buy preemptive pardons before you commit your sins, Um,
Wait, I just want to say that again. Preemptive
yeah,
pardons. So
yeah,
you plan a sin, you pay in advance for the pardon, and then you go and do your sin.
yeah, yeah, free ticket out. So the church put an end to this, a hundred or so years after, or maybe not even that long after this time. But at this moment, it was really problematic, and people were becoming very cynical. Um, and so, yeah, so power is really important in this story. Who has it? And the bishop obviously has quite a bit of power. Um, but not necessarily moral authority. He's extremely cynical. He's a really fun character to write. I didn't know I had such an inner cynic until I wrote The Bishop. And he's got his brother, who's the head of the Franciscans, who has sort of a moral power. And then there's Elise, who has a certain power of her own with the miracles, but also, again, a certain moral authority that I think she sort of gains through her experiences. And then you get the Beguines, who have sort of an economic power, and the church would love to be rid of the Beguines. The Beguines are a thorn under their saddle, but the mayors of the towns would protect them because they enjoyed the taxes off the businesses that the Beguines were running. So there's all these centers of power all jostling against each other throughout the book.
And again, that's so modern, right? This look of where is power? Where is it centered? How is it held? How do you break through to find your own power? Your own sort of way forward. And so again, even though we're set in like Bruges in the 1290s, 13th century, very modern, but the power rests with the church. And this was Elise's way through. I want to just shift gears just for a minute or two before we go to questions. For audience members out there, get your questions ready, pop them in the Q&A. We'll get to them in just a few minutes. So you have a very impressive career, Janet, before this book, as we said, in science, right? And you were doing amazing work. And then this came to you while you were at Radcliffe as a fellow. And we met both of us sort of on our second career sort of trajectory, right? At Grub Street, learning about the novel incubator. Can you talk for a minute about this transition from, your science life to now your writing life?
All right, I'm going to interrupt that because Rachel did not prompt this, but I want to show you the title. I want to show you her books because I love these books.
Thank you.
Under the Stars and Atomic Anna. And
you.
Rachel was the first one of our group published, and her books are historical fiction, and they're fascinating, and they deal with history and the ethics of science and really strong female protagonists. So I want to give a shout out to those.
Thank you.
And yes,
thank you.
Yes,
and back to you and Canticle.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yes.
So I've sort of believed that when you turn a decade, you ought to try a new trick. And when you're 20, everything's new. And then I turned 30 and I became a mother, and that sort of chose me, not me chose it in a certain way, that all the newness there. When I turned 40, I decided that I might want to learn classical Indian dance, and I found a school that was like so generous to allow me to practice with the preteens, and I sort of did that until my knees gave out. And then at 50, I thought, I've always kind of wanted to write. Like everybody on this webinar, I'm an avid reader, have been my whole life, and I loved historical fiction. And so I thought, okay, let's try it. So I wrote a sentence, and then I wrote another sentence. And by the time I got to the end of that paragraph, I was hooked. And it's like hard to stop. It like satisfies, like scratches an itch that I don't think I even knew I had until I tried.
Yes. Well, I'm so glad you found it. And I've read your novels in the drawer, and they're so good. I have, and they are so good. You never know when they're coming. But I wanted to just talk about that for another minute too, because we have questions coming in about your writing life and balancing and starting writing. Like, I want to be clear that almost every writer, if a writer tells you they don't have a novel in the drawer, like a published author, they're probably lying to you.
Yeah, fair.
Right? Do you think that's right?
I absolutely do. I'm very suspicious of any novelist who goes straight to publishing. Yeah.
Right. But this has been a long path too. This didn't just happen overnight, and you worked very hard to make this book happen. And that's clear in every page, and the beautiful writing and the story. Just before we turn to Q&A, can you talk briefly, just for like a minute, about the research, like how you research a book set in 13th century Bruges from here in our, 2026?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're researching the Tudor era, right, a couple hundred years later, you've got a lot of material because people are literate by then. There's more records left. It's easier to reconstruct what material culture was like. But if you're in 1299, like Is there glass in the windows of the bishop's house? How do you start a fire? All these questions, what are people actually wearing? And so, I did a lot of, reading of history books and corresponding with historians and reading, thank goodness for JSTOR and interlibrary loan. One of the best sources for the details were actually the reenactors from, like historical fairs. I didn't actually go to the fairs, but I figured out who they were and I wrote them. And that's how I found out, that a lace on those wedding sleeves, the wedding she almost has, you're thinking those sleeves that drag on the chapel floor. She wouldn't have pearls. She would have metal buttons. And so that kind of detail, you get there. And also you get it from the Psalters, the illuminated manuscripts that are also feature in the book, so these prayer books that are illuminated with beautiful paintings and lots of times include details about daily life. So it was sort of everything. Yeah.
Right, right. I mean, you really have to, I guess, dig through because the fact that, as you mentioned, people weren't literate. Like you didn't have diaries,
Right.
right? You didn't have
Right.
letters, correspondence, right? So how do you figure all that out? I don't know. And this is also why it's fiction, because sometimes you probably had to fill in a few holes.
Yeah. Although honestly, as an academic, like I don't,
No?
I don't know. I tried to hew pretty close because it's like, fingernails on a chalkboard to knowingly put something wrong in there. Although I did
Yes.
accidentally put tomatoes in a garden, and Goodreads readers let me know that was impossible.
Oh, I love that when the readers are that good that they find stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to turn to some of the questions in the Q&A now. So keep them coming in. Unfortunately, we only have like another 12 minutes and we're on a tight schedule, but we'll try to go through. So we're going to go like lightning, rapid fire. So Janet, so you have your full-time job, right? And then you're writing. How do you find time to write? How did you carve that into your life?
The quick answer is it's not full time anymore. About 10 years ago, I dropped back to half time and I have like a firewall between my science time and my fiction time because if I let it cross over, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot. Okay, could you discuss your publishing process? I love this. We have writers in the audience out here. People want to know, how did you find your agent and your publisher? And yes, share with us that process.
Yeah. So total shout out to Grub Street. If you're Boston, if you're lucky enough to be in Boston, you probably already know about Grub Street, the writers sort of collective, creative writing center. And both Rachel and I went through a program called the Novel Incubator. And at the end of that, first of all, they teach you all about craft, which is amazing. And at the end of it, about the business. And there was a meet and greet with agents that we were allowed to go to. And I met my agent there. He liked the book that's in the drawer. Um, and he stuck with me as I started to write Canticle, even though he was a little skeptical of the premise. He stuck with me. I was nervous about that one. And then we we put it out to about 20 publishers, and honestly, we had no takers. And I thought, oh no, another one in the drawer. This is it. And then there was one, and her name is Joey McGarvey, and she's my editor, and she is wonderful. And we had the editorial call with her, and where you're sort of trying to explore whether you have a shared vision for the book. And she said, I loved how this book takes faith seriously. And I thought, okay, good. And then she said, there's a pivot point, like 2/3 of the way through the book. And she says, I don't believe Elise would do that. And my heart dropped because this was like the whole premise of the book. The whole plot turned on that moment. I won't tell you what it is because it's a spoiler, but I thought, I can't do this. And I got off the call with Jonah, my agent, and he's like, could you try? you know? So, so I sat down and wrote out the possibilities, brainstormed, and Joey was right. It was
Yeah,
she needed to make the other choice. And so I had a great editing process with her.
that's
But
amazing.
it took a long time. We were editing for a good 9 months.
Yeah, it takes a long time. And also, I just want to underline the idea of community. Like we needed that
Yes.
community to get started because I also found my agent at that meet and greet afterwards, right? And
Yeah.
you just can't do it alone and sending out your queries and your everything out into the abyss. You're like one in a million if you're pulled out of there.
Yeah.
It
One
is
in a
hard.
million. Yeah. And you really need the companionship as you're going through all the ups and downs of this. It's a long road. Yeah.
Yeah. So you already answered this a little bit. Were there any surprising turns for you? But the first part, I think, is a great question that I would love to ask is where in the novel did you struggle the most to get it right? Like, where were you
Ooh.
struggling as the writer?
Oh, yeah, that good question. For me, it was actually the beginning, in many ways, because when I first wrote the novel, I started it with her running from home. But I had been told by an editor, well, we don't know who this is. I mean, actually, there was a question that came up in our first reading group, Rachel. I don't know if you remember. Somebody said, wait, we don't know who she is when she's running from home. So I ended up needing to almost sort of backfill a whole childhood story with an original wound. Her mother dies. And getting that pacing right, honestly, I'm still not sure I entirely did. It's sort of the slowest part of the book in some
You
ways.
did. You did it.
Oh, okay, thank you. That makes me feel better. Um, that was the hardest part, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Getting the backstory into the first like 5 pages so
Right,
you can
right.
move
Because
on.
you don't want to, like, at that point, I had enough of a story. I wasn't going to like put in a bunch of flashbacks that wasn't going to work with the propulsion of the story going forward. So it was
Yeah.
almost like an extended prologue in some ways. Yeah.
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 Yeah, but I think you did it beautifully because we really grounded us with the lace, with the love story with Finn. That for
Mhm.
me, that's just what made her so real, right? Because she's a 17-year-old and she's got the hormones and everything going on. Um, so one listener says that choosing this to become an anchoress just sounds unbelievable. Like it for me too, it was like, what? This couldn't be real the first time. Does it have to be forever? Did they ever get out of there? That's the
I'm only
question.
aware of one woman who did, Christina Carpenter, maybe. But no, they did not get out of it. Not for
Wow.
sickness, not for madness, not, that it is what it is. It was such a respected vocation, though, that there was even a manual written for them, the Ankerne Wisse, the anchoresses manual, which warned the anchoresses not to be too chatty with their visitors and not to admire their own white hands too much, because of course they weren't laborers. So
Right.
I think the positioning of it was really different than the way we see it now. We have so many more
Yeah.
options. Thank goodness.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank goodness we have places like Radcliffe and elsewhere, right, who pushed for women's education
Yeah.
and has brought us today. Um, so let's go back to the Beguines. Well, someone wants to know, did they own property? Sort of, was it a collective? Was it passed down in wills? Like, how did that work? The mechanics of the business of being a Beguine.
Yes, all of the above. They had sort of their own private homes within the community. And I'm talking about the court beguinages, the big ones, which had as many as 1,000 women at around 1300 at the peak of the movement. So women would sort of own their own homes that would be on this communal ground, often donated by patrons, by duchesses and the like. Um, and they would pass it down in wills for sure to new beguines. They would take in poorer beguines as boarders. And yeah, and then the businesses, there would be probably several businesses run from Beguinage, but wool making was an important one, and that's the one for the one in our book.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I just love this idea of this is women in business, right? This is the modernity. This is the way you could go, you could do something if you didn't want that forced marriage.
Yeah, not that the guilds were comfortable with that. There were all sorts of restrictions slapped on them. There were only certain colors of wool they could make or certain qualities of wool they could make, etc. But yeah, they
Right.
found a way.
Right. Of
Yeah.
course, very limited, but it was literally your only option. So we're watching feminism when we read
I know.
Canticle.
And what's interesting is writing a feminist book before the word exists, before the concept exists. You can't make them capital F feminists. It does not work. You have to be faithful to the historical view, but at the same time, they are. They're arguably the first women's movement, in
Yeah.
Western history. I
It's
love that.
amazing. I
Yeah,
remember you told me once that if Elise had an Instagram account, she would post resist,
she would
right?
think, yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's incredible that because that didn't even occur. Like that vocab would not have occurred for like been available to her.
No.
Okay, let's go back to your scientific background, looking at mysticism. Um, did you think of there's a relationship between mysticism and mental illness, right? We seem
Oh,
to have definitions for a lot of these illnesses or, healing now that we didn't have then.
no, it's a really good question. And people have asked me that. Do I consider that Elise was mentally ill? For me, no, she wasn't. But I do recognize the notion of visions and auditory hallucinations, there's a pretty fine line. And who's to say what is what? And I chose not to take it on myself to try to cast judgment on it one way or another. But it's a good question. It's a good question.
Right.
And you think of artists as well throughout history, many of whom, it's sort of suggested some of their brilliance came from the way they saw the world so differently. And I think that might be true here.
Right. You mentioned that the research was difficult to do, and you did scrape up a lot of it, though. Where can people find your sources or look into some of the research that you did?
Well, there's some of it in the author's note. I'm trying to think, if you go to my website, janetrichedwards.com, I think I've got some more there. But you know what? You can find my email there if you're curious. I love corresponding with readers. I love doing book clubs by Zoom or in person if you're around Boston.
Yes.
And if you go to that website, you can find that there and you can reach out to me. Yeah.
There's nothing better than a reader who's like, I want to know more because this was so interesting.
I know.
Yes.
When you create this imaginative world, alone, in my case, sitting on my bed, and then other people want to come in and join you there. It's so much fun.
It is. It is. So as a perfect follow-up for this, how did your research process change the book as you were writing?
Oh, good question. Good question. So, what changed the book a bit was, for those of you who've read it, you might be surprised to learn that Marta was not, there's 4 points of view, and she's the fourth one, and she comes in late. And when she came into the book fairly late in the editing process with my editor, Joey, there was a faint translation plot, but that got amped up because of who Marta was. And so in that way, as I learned more about the history of translations of the Bible, that really infused the book and really made it take a turn at that point that I had not seen coming until Marta kind of told it to me.
So a little bit of a twist on one of the questions in there, but has writing Canticle and bringing a lace to life on the page changed you as a scientist or as a writer? Like, how is that affecting you?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't know that it's changed me so much as a scientist, because science has pretty close guardrails for what we're doing. And I don't, like I said, I've got sort of a firewall between those parts of my life. But personally, I think exploring the faith and the courage of these women has been personally meaningful. And in some ways, because, these are politically hard times, politically fraught, I'm so impressed by the Beguines, the quiet resistance of the Beguines. There are people who go to the stake for their beliefs, but the Beguines themselves are, they're taking care of people, they're translating, they're doing all these things in a quiet resistance, and it makes a difference. And to me, that's heartening. Yeah.
Janet, thank you so much. As always, I have loved talking to you.
Oh, thank you, Rachel. This was really fun. And thank you, everybody, for being here.
Thank you to everybody. This concludes our program today. I want to thank Janet Rich Edwards for her reading and incredible conversation, as always, and the audience for those amazing questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information about upcoming Radcliffe programs, including our next virtual book talk on Tuesday, July 28th with author Tayari Jones, who will discuss her new book, Kin, and to see videos of past events, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today. Take care. Stay cool.